Welcome, everybody. We are now live in episode 5 with George Gantz on our podcast with Spiral Inquiry and Planksip. George, welcome back to the studio.
Good morning, Daniel. Here, I'm not in the same studio you are, but nice to see you.
Well, isn't this the virtual reality of COVID and pandemics? And I like it. I like not pandemics, of course, but I like what technology has brought and how it's brought us together. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, that's right. I happen to be in New York State right now. You're in Vancouver. We are chatting as if we're in the same room, sharing a cup of coffee with each other. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, we're moving along in our, I don't know if we can call it a novel study or, a textual analysis, maybe a pastiche to one of my intellectual heroes, which is E.O. Wilson and his book Consilience. So the jumping together is happening to us from East Coast to West Coast, but let's see if we can offer a few more insights into this work and the namesake of the podcast.
I'm with you. I'm excited to spend time with E.O. He's a brilliant mind and willing to take in trying to address big questions. So I appreciate that.
Okay, so we are still focusing on the Enlightenment here with chapter 3. And I'd like to maybe start with Condorcet. Does he bring up anything from your perspective? I mean, even just free form association. I mean, you know that he's with the Enlightenment, but does he ring any sort of story or elaboration from your side?
I didn't read him as a young man. So I felt he was stodgy, and I was impatient, and I think as I've gotten older, I've appreciated nuance that comes with many of those great figures of history. You get one accounting and you hear one thing and think that's it. But all of these great minds really dealt with a wide variety of issues and taking things in a broad perspective. And, useful to go back and reread what they said from a different perspective in your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in reading this chapter, one of the things that E.O. Wilson brought to my attention, at least as a broad overview about Condorcet, is the tragic nature of his ending, despite the end of his life, despite such a promising mind, I guess, such a capable and beautiful mind. Now, I think when I hear some of these types of things, that this is just kind of the unfolding of history, and we know that the French Revolution and these types of activities, which decimated and changed France in particular, just left deep scars. I don't know about you, but the Rousseauian type of tradition and the overturning of society, to me, I'm very skeptical about this type of thinking, predominantly because of the lessons that history has shown us in and through the French Revolution. Are you as equally as bearish, I guess, on the on some of these um, overturning of the status quo kind of conversations.
Well, it's interesting because um, uh, first of all, Condor, a great thing at the time, becomes a symbol and an image and and a potential target. And the French Revolution, I think, was one of where some of the ideals of individualism and kind of took hold and grabbed a hold of people, and then in the process of trying to break the old towards the new, the period of uncertainty became a period of chaos, and in chaos, lots of different can happen, lots of actors can play into the role, and I think you sort of the history of the revolution of Trump, and then finding that the end result of that chaos was so bad that they went back to as a solution to solving that chaos. So yeah, I think it's first of all, because he was a great intellect, he was a target in the chaos that ensued. Lots of passion can arise, and and the mob psychology issue of just caught up in something and feel wonderful thing, and then finding out that it's just worse than where you started. So important lessons for being more incrementalist than revolutionist. If you have a system that can be moved and nudged and corrected in a way that doesn't break apart the foundation and bring chaos, then maybe you're better off. But that might be a notion of ours, that we can somehow effectuate these changes incrementally as opposed to having to break some of them apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'd actually like to build on that because when I think it goes to the heart of consilience, and let me point to this is veering a bit because I mean the idea that Wilson is putting forward in the beginning of chapter 3 is that marker point for the end of the Enlightenment was in fact the death of Condorcet, and so we went from this tradition and emergence of the philosophes to their extinction and the butchery and the horrors that emerged in history following that, and manifest in the French Revolution, and then surfaced with Napoleon and various different things. I mean, listeners would know that sort of story, but I want to move forward to more of a contemporary conversation and commentary. Is that in a spirit of consilience, of bringing together an understanding of two perspectives? Let's look at one particular type of conversation between capitalism and Marxism. Okay, now really different from what we're looking at here in the text. Okay, but my issue here is that resolving two ideological systems that are so that the entrenched in the ideology, right? I also find myself to lean predominantly towards an incrementalist strategy, predominantly because you have something to base your changes on. And if you rip things down and eliminate things from, the foundations moving forward, this is just this has such dire and devastating consequences, or the potential for the loss of human life and the potential for suffering is so enormous. Um, I'm not giving you a point to interject here, but let me kind of summarize the point and say that as incrementalists, is it not a something that we can realize that at least we have the visibility of where the suffering and the problems are, where we can improve? Whereas if we rip down and start over um, in a revolutionary mindset, does that not open up and undo any potential good that is in our collective activities?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd be different view of it though, and that is that human beings are naturally subject to the risk of taking something in as a belief structure and then having it be dogma. And I think we see in kind of the mathematics of complexity, nuance, and uncertainty is a lot more of a reality than humans normally want to, because of our tendency to fixate on a simple solution and embrace it, with all of our vigor. And if you at Marx as a philosophical effort to understand how to be able to collaborate together to build something better than simply a dog eat dog, the owners of the assets become rich and everybody else create that as a dogma, and as a philosophical sort of discussion about human nature, it makes sense to consider the new, adopt something as a dogma, and then ahead with it as a monolithic construct, as was done in some of the communist efforts. Loses the ability to be flexible and responsive, and becomes a totalitarianism that that terrifying in terms of what to humans. So I think the tendency we have to adopt a structure and turn it into a dogma becomes a political mantra, and practice into behaviors that are really horrifying. It's happened many times in history. We look at the world today and we feel like there may be a risk that this will happen again. So I might cast it, I think as explorers of the philosophical world, I think we are interested in the nuances, not necessarily the adoption of us, but look for the cracks, look for the nuance, look at things that we don't quite understand, and that'll bring humility. I think dogma is letting go of the concept of humility and embracing something as a be all and end all. And if you do that, you run the risk of running off the lemmings, or doing things to other people late in hindsight is just not acceptable.
I like the reference to the lemurs there. That's the lemmings. That's a good one. Let's see, where should we take this? I'm just looking at this page here about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract. 30 years later, and he introduced the slogan "Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity," and an abstraction in reference to the general will. So, do you find any of that potentially dangerous to focus on? I mean, does it inevitably lead to an ideological framework?
Well, when it becomes a political, you know, a political rallying cry, rallying the emotions of human beings, behind it, and it becomes a dogmatic appeal bereft of, as a philosophical principle. I think you ask what does human thriving require? What does human thriving mean? And of course, those are important to human thriving. Is to be comfortable with yourself as a individual, to have the liberties to do the things that to you, and to do it in fraternity with the other human beings that we all live with. So it's a beautiful sentiment. As a political slogan, it can really go off the rails, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to be a little bit careful with this one, and I'm pulling back into a Marxist type of questioning here as well. I find that if you have an academic who has spent a lot of time in that research, or researching, Marxist types of thinking, and work. How would you tell an academic that they're being dogmatic? I mean, that's a very difficult thing to do, because it's almost it's antithetical with their ideal of exactly who they are as an individual. And is the response that comes back a pure ad hominem attack, like, you just don't understand Marxism, so that's why you're not capable of even criticizing it? And again, it just reiterates the point that it's a form of dogma.
So that's a good question, and I think probably this tool that's available to any of us, if we're in a conversation about issues that may be held deeply, is to go back to Socrates, or for that matter, Jesus. Their strategy in a point of contention or point of conflict was to ask questions. And sometimes those questions were leading questions. I mean, Socrates, would sort of lead his audience a particular pathway with a series of questions. And Jesus is his point of confrontation with Pilate or others in the temple. At points of confrontation, he would ask questions. Essentially, in the case of the woman that was accused of adultery, let any of you that are without sin, cast the first stone, because she was going to be stoned, and they drop their stone. So being asked questions in a way that expands the constructs, or expands the context, so that have people begin to look at some of the nuances in play. That seems to be the best strategy for avoiding the personalism and ad hominem, your own dogmas. Avoid your own dogmas by asking questions. What do you think, Daniel?
Well, your answer seems so sensible, and seems so so achievable in a way. Like, it seems like that's such a good starting point to have open conversations, with the foundation being humility, right? I mean, and then again, referring to Socrates, right? And as that intellectual hero. And then subsequently you referenced Jesus as well. I mean, that's fine. That's fair enough. And so your explanation seems fine. The issue that I have is that if the conversation contains a response that is dismissive because one side has a lack of understanding, but there's no attempt to bring and clarify that understanding, That is what I find to be frustrating. And then even further, if there's a um, if there's something in the response that negates your voice entirely because of your class, right? Like, so I'll go back to Marxism for a minute. And if we say something like the bourgeoisie are a byproduct of the class struggle, it's an emergent phenomenon of class that really offers the society no um, net benefit or gain, and that their rationalizations are purely that, have no claims on reality. If I find myself, if George, you find yourself in that privileged middle class, right? Um, there is no starting point, right? There is no because your very existence and identity as a middle class contributor to society is negated from and I have to say it, an ideology.
Yeah, and that's a good example of the way categories can be used um, to simplify and to then uh, put certain categories in boxes, uh, and categorization can um, uh, can affirm dogma. So it becomes kind of this self-fulfilling kind of attitude. I think, I think the tendency to racism is, category and be used to create separation and differences, and then you don't have to take this seriously. So, hey, you're a member of the bourgeoisie. Everything you say is colored by that. I don't have to listen to you because all you're doing is defending your role in this. And I think that happens in philosophical discourse as well, where we'll categorize and then put the other them into a category where they don't have to be listened to anymore. I think that's human nature. Um,
I like your summary of the xenophobia as not just racism, but as an us versus them dichotomy, right? So if two people come to a conversation and impregnated in their in their worldview is an us versus them sort of mentality, there is a xenophobic bias at play. That just there naturally is, and to some degree, I think we as humans form these an us versus them. We form groups. We are tribal by nature, so part of it is part of our human nature.
and that the word tribe is there's a couple of books about tribalism and our tendency, and there are a lot more logical studies that have been going on, kind of looking at the ways human beings deal with these categories and identities, and it's pretty strong. Our innate biases are actually pretty strong. Some of the studies would indicate that if we are identifying with a particular group of people, as one of us, and then there's another group of people that are as not one of us in our minds, we tend to be very towards those within our group and very forgiving, able to have conversations about this and give them the benefit of the doubt. We tend to do that very easily within our own group. But anybody outside or in the outside we tend to judge them pretty harshly and from the worst view. In other words, we take that outside group and we tend to give them qualities or characteristics that are very negative and very harsh. that tendency of humans to do that is part of our evolutionary heritage, to be suspicious of those outside your clan or outside your tribe, because guess what? That survival depends on being somewhat suspicious of the outside. Evolutionary value, but in the context of a global society where you're trying to figure out how to make things work, across a globalized station, that's not it's not very it's no longer a useful evolutionary perspective. It's actually getting in the way. So trying to find ways to open up the perspective, break down some categories, and look for, realize that, well, it's a different after all. Let's look at those nuances. Let's make sure language they're using when we're talking with our in-group, we might use one language. When we tend to talk to others, there's a different language and a different perspective. Let's be aware and try and uncover them so we can go at as that means you don't just give the benefit of the doubt to people in your own group. You should be giving the same benefit of the doubt to people who are in other groups, because we're all human beings, and ultimately we all share a lot of the same aspirations about a living human being and a thriving life. So I don't know. That's it's an interesting thread for this conversation about the Enlightenment, which the Enlightenment as a whole, and I don't agree necessarily with E.O. Wilson. It was still living in pieces of that sense of positive. The world is positive. Humans can be positive. Technology and are positive. Helping them move forward. So there's a progressivism of the Enlightenment that I don't think has been abandoned. But today is different than it was even 40 years ago, 50 years ago in his day.
Yeah, so basically what he was just saying is it was the end of the Enlightenment as envisioned by the French philosophers. And then here he says issues of their time. So Voltaire, Montesquieu, D'Alembert, Diderot, Helvetius, I don't know if I pronounced that right. And then that was Condorcet's mentor. The economist Anne Robert Turgot, Baron de la Lune, and I know I said that incorrectly, but yeah, this is now. I just want to make sure that maybe I'm bringing you along as well, but also for the audience, the reason why I had focused on this social unrest and upheaval was this point in this passage here about the mob mentality, the us versus them. Some 300,000 nobles, priests, political dissidents, and other troublemakers imprisoned, and 17,000 died within the year. In Robespierre's universe, who was the, kind of like the enforcer, the goals of the Jacobins were noble and pure. They were as he serenely wrote in February 1974, shortly before he himself was guillotined, the peaceful enjoyment of liberty and equality, the rule of that eternal justice whose laws have been engraved upon the hearts of men, even upon the hearts of the slave, who knows them not, and of the tyrant who denies them. So it's this idea that there's this tyrannical oppressor that is robbing people of their potential for prosperity, and that's the reason I had brought it in, and went in such a contemporary sort of spin on this for this episode.
Yeah, Robespierre in that passage is the of the Enlightenment, positivity. The hearts of all slaves are the same as the tyrant. But the actions that promoting and were completely at variance with the principles that he was espousing. So, yeah, and the populist rhetoric, using that populist rhetoric to foment the mobs, and get them moving is, it's on the human race is at risk of those kinds of and extremism coming out of a distorted sense of the public good. I mean, it distorted too, and the words of what he represented as the public good were quite at odds with quite at odds. And we have those risks today.
Absolutely.
I mean, you have leaders, tending to rise on by appealing to emotion, and they can drive the populace in a mob type with some quite extreme and quite points of view that are really quite at odds with the underlying aspirations of the populations, and things that we can agree about in terms of what human thriving really means.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, so much of this particular chapter from Wilson is very much, has really covered really filled in a lot of knowledge and a lot of context for me on Condorcet. So I really, really appreciated this particular chapter. You'd say here, the Enlightenment gave rise to the modern
tale. Go ahead.
We're now at a point in the text, we're looking at page 38, where it says, the Enlightenment gave rise to the modern intellectual tradition of the West and much of its culture. Yet while reason was supposedly the defining trait of the human species and it needed only little more than cultivation to flower universally, it fell short. Humanity was not paying attention. Humanity thought otherwise. The causes of the Enlightenment's discipline, which persist to the present day, illuminate the labyrinthian well springs of human motivation. It is worth asking, particularly in the present winter of our cultural discontent, whether the original spirit of the Enlightenment, confidence, optimism, eyes to the horizon, can be regained. And should it be regained?
Yeah, and I think a very strong thread that's arisen. Well, let's see. This was written in 19. And time, I think we began to see some a rise of optimism in what some have called the liberal view of capitalism and free enterprise as the solution to all of human problems, that echoes some of the progressivism of the Enlightenment and has that quality of being buoyant and optimistic, and as in many ways of increasing the the economic of people. So I think that thread is very much today. That Enlightenment thread is very much alive today in of capitalism and free markets as the answer to all problems. But it's got a view that is the nuances of the tendency for people to interpret rules in the ways that they want to, polarization of haves and have-nots that then become an unstable set of circumstances that will have to adjust. And so is there going to be harassment down the road, or is it going to be incremental? Are we going to get how we need to put limits on the excesses of capitalist enterprise and or how are we going to address those the areas where the neoliberalism is really not of the world? It's a myopic view that doesn't view the totality of the whole and the rising inequality. So there we are, modern day.
Yeah. I get that. It's such a predominant narrative in the world, and let's maybe move over to someone like Steven Pinker and bring out just the concept that we are in the most I guess the best times right now. Right? I mean, not with the pandemic, but I'm thinking of the of his one particular book where he talks about I believe it was the better natures of what is it?
Better angels of our human nature.
Yeah, that's right. Right. And so it was really shocking to him why he got such pushback to say that things are actually better than they appear. And if we're looking at society as a whole, and we think that we're kind of a pessimistic sort of class, right? Is this, like things are not as good as they appear, right? Despite the numbers presented in a way, Professor Pinker says, "Hey, look, guys, it's not as bad as it, as the modern discourse is actually telling us." Right? As the popular opinion goes, the previous generation in the good old years was not better than it is now. By so many standards, we're actually in a better situation. Now, it can be argued that there's certain aspects of that have certain trade-offs that we may want to correct or move towards something that is better. But can't we just give him that? Can't we say, thank you, Stephen. Your assessment is very well taken, and it's nothing predictive in the future that it has to stay that way. But yeah, we are in a position of greater prosperity for all. And is there income disparity? Is there differences in the world? Absolutely. But literacy levels have risen. All the key metrics of society have actually increased, in terms of average wages for people around the world, or poverty has actually increased, or assuaging the poverty problem has actually, taken place, throughout the world. And if we don't acknowledge that, we neglect all the work that has been put towards these problems.
Yeah, and I think that's the aspect of Pinker's work, is to help bring to our attention the fact that things in aggregate are better than they used to be. And the other fellow that's done a lot of statistical work on, his name is Angus Madison. I don't know if you've seen any of his work, but as best as he could, the economic status back to 2,000 years and on. A lot of it's pretty speculative, but it's been a pretty amazing ride for human civilization in aggregate, and I continued. But as you point out, we don't know that it's going to continue, and where things go backward for a period of time. So, yes, the last 200 years is spectacular in terms of average standard of living, enabling a tremendous population growth, and here we are with global. But there are instabilities also built into that system, and although in better, there are classes of individuals and categories categories or groups of individuals that have not benefited from improvement. And you have part of the population is getting things are getting a little for, and you have part of the population really getting the benefits of that. That disparity grows, and that disparity can create a social disequilibrium. And anytime you have a system in disequilibrium, you run the risk of perhaps you run the risk of a major disruption. This is an interesting analogy. You have a dam that's creating an influx of huge wealth upstream, and those people that are living upstream are just benefiting, but the people downstream are increasingly desperate because of the increasing inequality, and at some point, dams break, and then you have a collapse. And we've had many in the capitalist enterprise that are warning signs. And you have social unrest that's taking place in various places around the world, and we have climate change. That's a warning sign. So out of the fast changing environment with technological change and climate change and traffic change, we have these instabilities that seem to be growing. Well, that runs the risk of getting into a backwards for a while. And if you the size of these problems or the size of the dam that's there, the catastrophic for humanity in a very short period of time. So that's the counter's optimism. And even Pinker recognizes in Enlightenment now that that's the underpinnings of this liberty, equality, free, the good values of that Enlightenment, are found to be the case in significant pockets of this human species. So I'd say there's positivity about progress we've made, but there's also concern about what's happening now and then what happens next. Because Pinker and Angus Madison, they're always, because that's all we really do when you're looking for data, you're looking backwards. But dynamic systems in disequilibrium, don't follow trends. They can go in anything going from one disequilibrium trying to find another equilibrium. It can be a lot of chaos in that process. If the dam breaks, you have for a period of time and a lot of bad effects. So that's it's great to see that human civilization has made, particularly in aggregate. It's amazing, the average, but those of us that are on the wave where we're seeing most of those benefits, let's be realistic and let's be our eyes to the way it feel for those on the bottom. I have a great quote, by the way, actually from my stepson. He's a bright young guy. Life is not fair, and if it were, you'd be a lot worse off. We can say that. Not everybody can say it. We can say that, and we're the lucky ones. So John Rawls' concept of how to judge something from an ethical standpoint. Well, imagine the veil of ignorance, and you don't know what station you've been born into in the world. Then you make your judgment, and what is just. Part of the concern of Pinker and others is that that we're in a state where it's not equally fair to disequilibrium. That means there's stresses in society, things that causes disruption.
Yeah, yeah. So, in terms of a wise statement, do we just acknowledge that the world has inequities, right, and that we do come from different socioeconomic backgrounds? We reside in different classes. We live in different um, countries with different levels of relative prosperity, and that the answer is not a homogeneity of sorts to disperse it to equality amongst all living people around the world. That is an unrealistic and unattainable goal, right? Like, is that the point where we come up and say, I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't have compassion, that we don't bring people out of poverty. It doesn't mean that we have a minimum bar for people to uh, achieve a happy and healthy life. It doesn't mean that does not mean that that is the case. But what it does mean is to say that maybe there are some biological differences. Maybe there are some differences that actually um, predispose individuals to be more prosperous than others. And that's such an abrasive sort of position to take, because we live in a culture where that is instantly called out as being I guess, like, part of the patriarchy or part of the dominant class, or symptomatic of the oppressor state. And that's very frustrating for me, especially if we're talking about um, examples in biology, for example.
I think in discussing these kinds of things, we really need to be careful about language and about perceptions and about our own biases, and think the if we use as a core value uh, wanting human beings to thrive collectively, then a situation that could be inherently not good. How you address it is is an important question of. So it's more like they ask, well, let's do better. We want to do better. We want to find ways to move greater equality, greater liberty, greater unity, brotherhood, and the collective experience of all of us on the faces. So those are aspirational goals, necessarily specific in how you get there. But it is useful to have those. One of the things that the Enlightenment, as thinker sees it, is useful for is to let's look at those virtues and those goals that our society moves towards, and that leads to hard questions of how we're going to get there, and so know that it's never a white set of circumstances, but how are we going to move there, both in terms of our individual sensibilities and our collective choices that we make, through structures, and how do we embrace culture that is moving in that positive way. So these are when you get out of the philosophical aspect of uh, what is valuable, what is what are the ultimate goals that we hope everybody will share, in life. We'd like people to be able to share these things. It was a very, very much more difficult and practical question about, well, how are we going to do that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, thanks for kind of pulling me away from some possibly from a thicket of barbarous, a barbarous thicket trap sort of thing. Cause it is a delicate one to work around, isn't it? Right. Like I do appreciate that. It's,
Right, and humility is it because um, we have to recognize as we do when you the so-called privileged position, you have access to goods and services. You're getting the engine. It's very easy not to not see that and to discount the further away from you. Like the hardships that are existing in other groups and other categories and other in other neighborhoods, and we're distant from them, and it's easy to not take those into account. If you back again to the philosophical principles of what is right and what is good, and then use a concept like John Rawls, the veil of ignorance. That's a working on that humility and understanding, and understanding what the world may look to other people. So it's a good exercise to do, no matter what your station.
Yeah, I let me follow it this way and say I agree with you. It really sounds really good. However, what if you put a situation into perspective like this and say, both of you and I like your terminology, have benefited from the economic realities in North America. The United States is not without its issues. Canada is not without its issues, but I'm very fortunate to live in a prosperous, economically stable country, and I'm assuming that you do as well. There are a lot of other countries in the world that would dramatically change my ability to be the kind of person that I am and to live the kind of life and lifestyle that I have the option to live. Would you agree with that as an American citizen?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah,
Okay, so let me see if
definitely.
I'm on the
I'm
right.
very good at that.
Yeah, so let me see if I'm on the right kind of reasoning. And I can see that there might be some fault in this, but I'm trying to get a little bit abstract with the scenario I want to paint for you here. Um, your summary was really great. I do think that's very good summary. However, if the reality of implicating or the reality of implementing a world that has more equality, right? If that if we take from our starting point that we live in a world of finite resources and finite capability, and notice how I coupled those two pieces. So there is the counter argument in more of a right wing tradition that says, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. There is no limit of resources. We still have plenty of resources. So don't base your economic policy on finite resources, because finite resources coupled with technology do have the ability to keep a growth pattern that can continue to give economic success and prosperity to more people around the world. And so I'm taking a different starting point, saying, look, we live in a world with finite resources and a finite capability to um, implement those resources. Okay. And so, starting from that standpoint, if we imagine an implementation strategy where we say, let's put the growth for, say, like the developed countries on hold or to a minimum, okay, so that the rest of the world can increase their relative economic prosperity, okay. that's a particular framework that is antithetical with a lot of the suffering and the pockets of inequality that exist within our own pockets of living, because there is great economic disparity within the United States and within Canada. So I think the way I'm looking at this is that it's very difficult to take a broad, and I'm using this just as a term to get the point across, feel good story, and then actually when it comes down to actually implementing it, that's the problem. That's really the problem, George, is that that's the part where I question. I go, I don't understand how you do that.
Well, I don't have an answer for you because I'm not a politician, and I'm someone that likes big questions. And uh, I think is understanding how we got here and what current set of circumstances means for different people who are in different categories and categorical circumstances. And I think um, uh, that's an important part of the political process that you have few nations and organizations really tried to undertake that. And then the other thing that is that go back to whether it's in nature or in systems, chemical systems, systems, um, uh, disequilibrium is a recipe for disturbance. And whether it's difficult to accomplish certain ends or not, work avoiding catastrophic responses to systems in disequilibrium is an important goal. So, for example, you talked about the incrementalism versus radicalism of, could have imagined a different set of circumstance for France where the disequilibriums of, of the monarchy and of people of Britain and who were abusing their positions of privilege just to a certain extent, there had been incremental changes to the power of those that were exerting it unfairly, brought the authority to a broader base, tending to equalize those social structures, at having a very different outcome than the one that France actually had. You might be able to draw some parallels. I'm not a historian. Be able to draw some contrast to what became revolutionary zeal in the colonies, because the colonies, revolted, and but then they came together to create a consensus body of law, the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, that brought the Constitution together, and it had principles of power. It had principles of democracy built in document from the very front end, and some people had to give some things up.
Yeah.
And an amazing began. And we can look at the story, and it had its flaws. But this country had benefited significantly from that. But had those choices about, I'm going to give up something in order to get this greater good. The 13 colonies, negotiating, the representatives of those colonies, the landowners, negotiating to end up with something. So you had to give something. So I think we're at a state in the world now where some people, including myself, are going to have to give some things up in order to a better outcome overall and a more stable outcome overall. Well, we did get into politics. How about that?
It was so hard for me not to with this particular chapter. You know, George, I think that's a really good. I don't know about you. You give me a yay or a nay, but that I really like that summary as an ending because we have to give something up in order to move towards something better. And you heard it here first under, from George Gantz. I think that is a really good summary of a complex framework that we were teasing through in today's episode. George, are you okay with wrapping it up on that sentiment?
The one thing I add is that is also an ingredient in a success, because if you have someone who is dogmatic way of thinking, and according to E.O. Wilson, maybe the physical sciences, and then you have the biological sciences, and they're committed to another way of thinking, and they're going to have to give something up in order to find that greater joyous unity between those branches of science. So I think maybe we can apply that. Maybe this is sort of the dialectic kind of, one another point of view, and there needs to be a giving up and synthesis to create something better. I don't know. I like that.
I do too. It felt like it was a little bit more difficult winding our way through today's episode, but I like how you pulled it all together, George. You're a class act, my friend. So on that, let's
I love having you as
say
a friend,
goodbye to
Daniel. I love
everybody.
it.
Okay. All right, George. Until next week, I'm saying goodbye to everybody. And
next time.
You bet. Thanks, man.